28 years later, the murder of JonBenét Ramsey is solved. Had she lived, the child beauty queen would be 34 now. 48 Hours correspondent Erin Moriarty has been covering this case since 1999. And
on December 25, 1996, a 6-year-old girl went to sleep in her own bed on Christmas night. By morning, she was gone. No broken doors, no shattered windows, no signs that anyone had forced their way in or out. Just a 2.5-page handwritten ransom note sitting on the kitchen staircase. Written with a pen from inside the house, on a notepad from inside the house, demanding $118,000 for the safe return of a child, who at that very moment was already dead. In the basement, 50 feet away. The kidnappers never called. The evidence pointed everywhere at once. And what investigators uncovered over the following hours, months, and years would become the most explosive, most debated, and most shocking child murder case America has ever seen. Her name was JonBenét Ramsey. She was 6 years old, and what happened inside that house on the night of December 25, 1996, is something you are not going to see coming. This is her story. And it starts with a phone call made at 5:52 in the morning by a mother who sounded absolutely terrified, but whose story, investigators would later say, didn't quite add up. If you're just finding this channel, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this is exactly the kind of story we cover here. Cases that don't let you go. Let's get into it. To understand what happened inside that house, you first need to understand who the Ramseys were. Because this was not an ordinary family. JonBenét Ramsey was a businessman at the top of his game. He served as president of Access Graphics, a computer subsidiary of Lockheed Martin based in Boulder. 1996, the company crossed $1 billion in annual revenue. John was sharp, composed, and well-connected. He had been married once before and had 3 adult children from that first marriage. His wife, Patricia, known to everyone as Patsy, was a former Miss West Virginia and Miss America contestant. She was warm, social, and deeply involved in her community. The Ramseys attended St. John's Episcopal Church, hosted dinner parties, and were known throughout Boulder as a family that had it all. They had 2 children together, Burke, who was 9 at the time, and JonBenét, born August 6, 1990, in Atlanta, Georgia, the younger child, the one with the wide smile and the stage presence that filled a room. From a young age, JonBenét competed in child beauty pageants, largely encouraged by Patsy and her grandmother. She won titles, including America's Royale Miss, Little Miss Colorado, Little Miss Charlevoix, Colorado State All-Star Kids Cover Girl, and National Tiny Miss Beauty. She performed with choreographed routines, elaborate costumes, and a confidence that was hard to ignore for a child her age. Those pageant images would later become the lens through which the entire world viewed this case, and not always fairly. But that comes later. What matters here is the night of December 25, 1996. The Ramseys spent Christmas evening at the home of their friends Fleet and Priscilla White. It was a relaxed gathering, dinner, conversation, the kind of holiday night that feels completely normal in hindsight and devastating in retrospect. They returned home somewhere between 9:30 and 10. JonBenét was tired. By most accounts, she was carried upstairs and put to bed. Burke went to his room. John and Patsy settled in for the night. The house went quiet, and then, somewhere between 10 p.m. and 5:52 a.m., something happened. Something that has never been fully explained. Not by investigators, not by the family, not by anyone. That gap is where this entire case lives. Patsy Ramsey woke up early on December 26. She was heading downstairs when she found it. 3 pages of handwritten paper sitting on the bottom step of the kitchen staircase. She read the first few lines and her world collapsed. The note claimed JonBenét had been taken by a small foreign faction. It demanded $118,000 for her safe return. It warned against contacting police or the FBI. It threatened beheading if instructions weren't followed. And it was signed with a cryptic phrase. Victory, SBTC. Patsy called 911 at 5:52 a.m. "We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please." The dispatcher asked her to stay on the line. She didn't fully comply. Before police even arrived, Patsy had called her friends, her pastor, and victim advocates. all of whom came to the house and moved freely through it. That decision, made in a moment of panic and grief, would haunt this investigation for decades. Officers arrived within minutes. What followed was one of the most criticized first responses in American true crime history. The house was not immediately sealed as a crime scene, because the note described a kidnapping, not a murder. Investigators treated it as an abduction situation. JonBenét's bedroom was cordoned off, but the rest of the home remained accessible. Friends and family walked through the kitchen, the living room, the hallways. Surfaces were touched. Items were moved. A forensics team was eventually called, but by then, the scene had already been compromised in ways that would never be fully undone now. About that ransom note, it was written on a notepad found inside the Ramsey home. The felt-tip pen used to write it was also found inside the home. 2.5 pages long. An extraordinary length for a ransom note. Most ransom communications are brief, direct, and written in advance. This one read almost like a letter, with specific instructions, emotional appeals, and oddly sophisticated phrasing mixed with deliberate misspellings. Words like fussiness, possession, sat alongside phrases like and hence, adequate size attaché. The note referenced John's business dealings. It warned against involving John's Southern friends, a possible reference to his connections in Atlanta, and the $118,000 demand. That figure matched John Ramsey's Christmas bonus from the previous year almost exactly. Not approximately, almost exactly. The FBI noted something else. Something that experienced investigators found deeply unusual. Kidnappers do not typically write ransom notes at the scene. They prepare them in advance, deliver them, and leave. Writing a 2.5-page note inside the victim's home, using the family's own materials, while the family is present. That is not standard kidnapping behavior. The kidnappers never called. Not that morning, not that afternoon, not ever. By 1 p.m., hours had passed with no contact from whoever claimed to have JonBenét. Detective Linda Arndt, who was managing the scene, asked John Ramsey and his friend Fleet White to walk through the house and look for anything unusual or out of place. They started in the basement. Fleet White had already checked the basement earlier that morning and found nothing alarming. But this time, John led the way to a different area, a small latched storage room tucked into the corner, a room that an officer had walked past without opening. John unlatched the door and pushed it open. JonBenét was on the floor. She was partially covered by a white blanket. Black duct tape was over her mouth. A cord was tied around her wrists. Around her neck, a garrote, fashioned from a nylon cord and the broken handle of a paintbrush. Patsy Ramsey's paintbrush, from her art supplies stored in the basement. John picked her up and carried her upstairs. It was an instinctive act, a father reaching for his child, but it was also the moment that further contaminated an already compromised crime scene. The body had been moved. The position, the surrounding evidence, the spatial relationship between JonBenét and the room, all of it was now altered. Detective Arndt would later describe that afternoon as one of the most chaotic and overwhelming moments of her career. The autopsy was performed by Boulder County Coroner John Meyer. His findings were precise and clinical, and they raised more questions than they answered. The official cause of death, asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. JonBenét had suffered an 8.5-inch skull fracture, a significant blunt force injury to the right side of her head. She had also been strangled with the garrote found around her neck. The medical examiner determined that either injury alone could have been fatal. The sequence, which came first, was never definitively established. There was no evidence of conventional sexual assault. However, there were signs of vaginal trauma, and investigators believed the paintbrush handle may have been used as an instrument. No semen was found. Then came the detail that quietly became one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. Undigested pineapple was found in JonBenét's stomach and small intestine. The digestion timelines suggested she had eaten it shortly before her death, likely within 1 to 2 hours, and sitting on the kitchen table, in plain sight, was a bowl of pineapple and milk with a large spoon resting in it. Burke Ramsey's fingerprints were on that bowl. Patsy's were on the glass of tea beside it. The Ramseys maintained that JonBenét had gone straight to bed after returning from the Whites' home and had not eaten anything. But the pineapple said otherwise. Other physical evidence added more layers. A high-tech brand shoe print was found in the dust of the basement floor, a brand that neither John, Patsy, nor JonBenét owned. A single Caucasian hair, possibly pubic or auxiliary, was found on the white blanket covering her body, and on JonBenét's left palm, someone had drawn a small red ink heart. Every piece of evidence pointed somewhere. The problem? They pointed in different directions. Law enforcement agencies, independent linguists, and forensic document examiners spent years pulling apart that ransom note. And what they found was deeply contradictory. Handwriting analysts from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation concluded there were indications that Patsy Ramsey could have written it. They could not make a definitive determination, but they could not rule her out either. John Ramsey was ruled out entirely. The note's language was a puzzle in itself. Sophisticated vocabulary and sentence structure sat alongside deliberate, or careless, misspellings. It referenced John's professional world with a level of familiarity that suggested someone who knew the family. The $118,000 figure, matching John's bonus almost to the dollar, was either an extraordinary coincidence or a deliberate detail planted by someone with inside knowledge. The notepad the letter was written on came from inside the Ramsey home. So did the pen. Multiple pages from that notepad were missing and were never recovered. Investigators theorized that the writer may have practiced the note on earlier pages before settling on the final version, which would mean the note was composed inside the house, possibly while the family was present or asleep. The FBI's assessment was blunt. This did not look like a genuine kidnapping note. Real kidnappers prepare their demands in advance. They don't sit in a victim's home, use the family's stationery, and write 2.5 pages of instructions. The length alone was unprecedented in documented kidnapping cases. And yet, the note existed. It was real. Someone wrote it. Who writes a ransom note inside the victim's home? If this case has your mind running, you need to share this video. Send it to someone who loves true crime. The more people watching, the more pressure stays on cases like this one to get solved. Share it right now. What should have been a unified investigation became a war between two camps, and that war may have cost this case its only chance at justice. Boulder Police Department focused heavily on the Ramsey family from early on. The evidence, in their view, pointed inward. The note written on household materials, the garrote fashioned from Patsy's paintbrush, the pineapple, the $118,000 figure, the lack of forced entry. Lead detective Steve Thomas became one of the most vocal proponents of the theory that Patsy had killed JonBenét, possibly in a rage over a bedwetting incident, and that the scene had been staged afterward. The Ramseys, for their part, hired attorneys, a publicist, and private investigators almost immediately. They did not sit for formal police interviews until April 1997. More than 3 months after JonBenét's death. That delay, while legally defensible, deepened suspicion in the eyes of investigators and the public. On the other side of the fracture stood Lou Smith, a retired detective with an exceptional track record, brought in by District Attorney Alex Hunter to assist the investigation. Smith reviewed the evidence and came to a completely different conclusion. He believed an intruder had entered the home through a broken basement window, hidden inside, and committed the crime while the family slept. He pointed to the high-tech shoe print, the unidentified hair, the complexity of the garrote, and the DNA evidence that would later emerge. Smith eventually resigned from the case, not because he was pushed out, but because he felt the intruder theory was being systematically ignored in favor of building a case against the family. Steve Thomas resigned too, but for the opposite reason. In a public resignation letter, he accused DA Alex Hunter's office of protecting the Ramseys and undermining the police investigation. Two experienced investigators, the same evidence, completely opposite conclusions. In 1998, a grand jury was convened to review the case. They spent over a year examining evidence, hearing testimony, and deliberating. In 1999, the jury voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse resulting in death and being accessories to a crime. DA Alex Hunter refused to sign the indictments. He cited insufficient evidence to secure a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. Those indictments were sealed. The public didn't know they existed until 2013, 14 years later, when a judge ordered them released. 14 years. The grand jury had voted to charge the parents of a murdered 6-year-old, and the public never knew. For years, the case against the Ramseys rested almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. Then, the science changed everything. Or at least, it appeared to. In 2003, forensic investigators identified trace male DNA on JonBenét's underwear. The profile did not match John Ramsey, Burke Ramsey, or any other known contributor. It was an unknown male. In 2008, advanced touch DNA testing was applied to her long johns, the outer layer of clothing she was wearing. Again, an unknown male profile emerged. Again, no match to any Ramsey family member. That same year, Boulder County District Attorney Mary Lacey issued a formal letter exonerating John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey. The DNA, she stated, was sufficient to conclude they were not responsible for JonBenét's death. It was a seismic moment. After more than a decade of suspicion, public scrutiny, and a grand jury indictment that nearly became charges, the family was officially cleared. But the story didn't end there. Critics of the exoneration raised immediate concerns. Touch DNA, genetic material transferred through skin contact, can move from person to person, innocuously. A factory worker who handled the underwear during manufacturing, a store employee, someone who touched the garment before it was ever purchased. The sample, some analysts argued, could be a mixture of multiple contributors rather than a single unknown suspect. The unidentified male profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. It has never produced a match. As of 2025, the Boulder Police Department maintains an active task force dedicated solely to this case. Investigators are retesting existing evidence using Y-straw DNA analysis and mitochondrial sequencing, methods that were not available in 1996. Genetic genealogy, the same technique that identified the Golden State Killer, has been proposed as a potential path forward. Results from the current testing phase are anticipated in 2026. The DNA clears the Ramseys, but it hasn't identified anyone else. And until it does, the case remains open. No unsolved high-profile case escapes the false confessors. The JonBenét Ramsey case attracted one of the most bizarre. In August 2006, nearly 10 years after JonBenét's death, a man named John Mark Carr was arrested in Bangkok, Thailand. Carr, a former elementary school teacher, had confessed in emails to a University of Colorado professor that he had been with JonBenét when she died. He claimed he had drugged her and that her death was accidental. The arrest made international headlines. Carr was extradited to the United States. He gave interviews on the flight back, speaking calmly about JonBenét as though recounting a memory. His DNA did not match. Witnesses placed him in Georgia at the time of the murder. He was released without charge. Investigators and legal analysts widely concluded that Carr was a deeply troubled individual who had inserted himself into the case, not a perpetrator. Other names surfaced over the years. Gary Oliva, a convicted sex offender who lived in Boulder at the time and was later imprisoned for child pornography, was investigated and cleared by DNA. Randy Simons, a photographer who had worked with JonBenét on pageant photos, was also looked into and ruled out. Meanwhile, the media had already tried and convicted someone, just not in a courtroom. From the moment JonBenét's pageant photos hit the tabloids, the narrative was set. Patsy Ramsey was portrayed as an obsessive stage mother who had pushed her daughter into a world of adult performance. The images, JonBenét in full makeup, elaborate costumes, performing choreographed routines, were replayed endlessly. The coverage was relentless, often cruel, and frequently inaccurate. The Ramseys fought back. They appeared on CNN in early 1997, with Patsy looking directly into the camera and warning that a killer was still out there. They wrote a book, The Death of Innocence, laying out their account of events. They filed defamation lawsuits against media outlets and individuals who accused them publicly. Burke Ramsey, who was 9 years old when his sister was killed, spent most of his life out of the public eye. In 2016, he broke his silence in a series of interviews with Dr. Phil. During those interviews, he acknowledged being awake and downstairs after the family returned home from the White's party, a detail that contradicted earlier accounts, suggesting he had slept through the entire night. That same year, CBS aired a documentary that pointed to Burke as a possible suspect. Burke sued. The case was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. Patsy Ramsey never saw any of it resolved. She died of ovarian cancer in June 2006, at 49 years old. She was buried in Marietta, Georgia. The case was still open. Her name was still attached to suspicion she always denied. Two theories have dominated this case from the beginning, and they remain as divided today as they were in 1997. The family theory holds that JonBenét was killed inside the home by someone in the family, most commonly Patsy, possibly in a moment of anger, possibly over a bedwetting incident, with the scene staged afterward to simulate a kidnapping. Supporters point to the ransom note written on household materials, the garrote fashioned from Patsy's paintbrush, the pineapple that contradicts the family's account of that night, the $118,000 figure, and the grand jury's vote to indict. Intruder theory holds that an unknown individual entered the home, possibly through the broken basement window, hid inside, and committed the crime while the family slept. Supporters point to the unidentified male DNA, the high-tech shoe print belonging to no family member, the unidentified hair on the blanket, and the complexity of the garrote, which some investigators believe required knowledge and premeditation beyond what a panicked parent would produce. Both theories have gaps. Neither has been proven. So which do you believe? Nearly 3 decades have passed since that December morning in Boulder. JonBenét Ramsey would have been 35 years old today. John Ramsey has continued to push for the use of genetic genealogy in the investigation, the same forensic technique that cracked the Golden State Killer case after decades of dead ends. He has spoken publicly about his belief that the technology exists to identify the unknown DNA contributor, and that the only thing standing between the case and a resolution is the decision to fully commit to that path. The Boulder Police Department has not walked away. A dedicated task force remains active, working through over 1 million pages of case files that have been redigitized for modern analysis. Investigators are pursuing new witness statements, re-examining old ones, and applying forensic methods that simply did not exist in 1996. Y-star DNA analysis and mitochondrial sequencing are both being used on existing evidence samples. Results from the current testing phase are expected in 2026. The unidentified male DNA profile sits in CODIS. It has been there for years. No match has ever come back. The questions that have defined this case for nearly 30 years remain unanswered. Who wrote that note? And why inside the house? Why does the pineapple contradict the family's account of that night? Who fashioned a garrote from a child's mother's paintbrush? Whose DNA is on that clothing? And whose shoe print was left in the basement dust? JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was 6 years old. She had a gap-toothed smile, a competitive spirit, and a whole life ahead of her. She was found in the basement of her own home, on the day after Christmas, in a house full of people who said they didn't hear a thing. That contradiction, the silence inside a house where something terrible happened, is what has kept this case alive for 29 years. It is what keeps investigators coming back. It is what keeps the public watching, debating, and demanding answers. The case is not cold. It is not forgotten. And if the science delivers what investigators are hoping for in 2026, it may finally, after all this time, have a name to go with that DNA. Until then, JonBenét's case remains exactly what it has always been. A mystery hiding in plain sight, inside a house on 15th Street, on the coldest morning Boulder has ever known. If this case moved you, if you found yourself with more questions than answers by the end, then this channel is exactly where you need to be. Subscribe right now, because we cover cases just like this one. The ones that don't get solved, the ones that don't get forgotten, and the ones that deserve more than silence. Hit the bell so you never miss an upload, and leave a comment below. What do you think happened inside that house? I read every single one. See you in the next one.